Hello, Stacey.
Max, in the second half, you have Mitch Firestein, who has lots of charts, but in the first half, we have lots of data. You know, the Empire State Manufacturing Survey came out, and it looks like for the next 6 months, looking into the future, manufacturers in New York are not so optimistic. But actually, the IMF, who is also meeting in Washington, D.C., well, they've revised their forecast to look more optimistic for U.S. growth. They've increased the U.S. growth rate for 2018 by 0.2%. So they're saying everything's looking good through 2020, through the next elections. But we're going to get to that in the next episode. This episode, I want to focus on the tax cuts. So who's right, the Empire State Manufacturing Survey or the IMF? Well, wage growth well short of what was promised from tax reform. The latest employment situation report from the Bureau of Labor Statistics shows weekly employee earnings have grown $75 since tax reform passed, well short of the $4,000 to $9,000 annual increases projected by President Trump and House Speaker Paul Ryan. So since the tax passage, basically Americans have seen on average $6.21 increase in their weekly earnings, which obviously falls, it's like $323 a year. They had promised $4,000 to $6,000 to $9,000.
That don't sound so good.
No.
You know, it's all about optics.
Yeah.
Sounds good, but you know, there's a lot of gatekeepers and intermediaries, and those generally are the big corporations that will always glob the majority of any possible gains by anyone at any time.
That's right, and we'll actually get into that. So in the next headline about how basically all the tax cuts indeed did inject, well, over $1 trillion, didn't they? They cost over $1 trillion. Most of it has gone to the top. But back to the bottom here. Assuming a full 52 weeks of work, the $6.21 increase in weekly earnings would result in a $323 annual increase, nowhere near the minimum $4,000 promise and a $9,000 potential annual increases projected by President Trump and Speaker Ryan if significant cuts were made to corporate tax rates. Whether or not that's going to lead to anything, we don't know, but there were those $1,000 bonuses. That doesn't count those things that happened, like from the likes of Walmart gave $1,000 to every employee, American Airlines, Delta Airlines, all these airlines gave $1,000 to employees. So this doesn't count that as well.
Yeah, to me, it's a weekend beer, party. But other than that, it's meaningless. I've said always now for many years that the way the system should work is that every stock, bond, security underwritten by Wall Street or any bank in America, 1% should be carved out and put into Social Security, so that Americans, whether they have a job as minimum wage workers or whether they're CEOs, all across the spectrum, everyone gets to participate in this thing called the American economy. Because if you don't own stocks, you're not part of the American economy.
That's true. Most of it is owned by the top 10%. But let's go into one of the specifics. So, there were a lot of headlines that were captured in the first few weeks of the year, and that was that, $1,000 bonuses. That was the big number, right? So let's just show how paltry that actually was compared to the savings that these companies had. So they talk about Navient. They announced that it would be giving $1,000 bonuses to 98% of its 6,700 employees, paying out nearly $7 million in bonuses. While that may seem generous, it pales in comparison to Navient's potential tax savings. Using Navient's 2016 net income, its 2016 effective tax rate, estimated annual tax savings of nearly $200 million, and its announced bonuses, we calculate that announced bonuses represent less than 4% of Navient's potential tax savings. So we give them $100 million, and they give $4 million away.
Right. When I was in my teen years, I used to do magic in Times Square, and I used to watch the three-card Monte guys very carefully, and the tourists would come in, and they'd lose thousands of dollars. But it's very important when you're doing three-card Monte in Times Square to avoid having a tourist beat you up, to let them win once, particularly at the end. So they may lose $5,000, but if they win $20 at the end, in their minds, they're thinking, see, I'm a winner. I'm a winner, I beat the guy. Same thing in this instance. They take millions and billions of dollars worth of fraudulent tax engineering, but they give you $1,000, and in your mind, you're saying, see, I'm a winner. I'm the big winner here at the table. And it's sad that they use such base psychological tricks to fool millions of Americans into thinking that they're not getting completely raked over the coals, but it does work.
Well, it's also not $1,000 to most Americans. Remember, we know that something like 65% have less than $400 in savings for an emergency. Well, it's on a relative basis, then that might be a lot of money. But the fact that the likes of Navient are collecting 96% of a bonus, and only 4% go to the bottom 98% of their employees. Well, it's that income gap and that wealth gap in America. That's the problem, not necessarily how much money. When you talk about all the billionaire, that wealth and income gap, people say, well, the poorest Americans are doing better than the richest Africans in Somalia or something like that. So I think it's within the society, and that's the problem, I think, in the long term for economic growth, is that income gap. But in terms of just how much of these tax cuts, of the over $1 trillion in tax cuts, are going to the top, well, tax cut savings flow to company stockholders, trickle to hourly workers. In the first 3 months of 2018, investors received $109.2 billion in dividends, up more than 8% from the $100.9 billion received in the same period a year earlier, according to S&P Dow Jones indices. In fact, the S&P 500's quarterly dividend payments set a new record. And on top of that, JP Morgan has come out with an estimate of what the share buybacks this year will be, and that will be a new all-time high, which is $800 billion. $800 billion in share buybacks, about $1 trillion in tax cuts.
It's financial apartheid. Whether it's the way interest rates are structured to penalize the poor, or whether dividends are structured to enrich the kleptocrats. It's a version of financial apartheid. We live in an apartheid state here in America, engineered by Wall Street.
So $800 billion in share buybacks this year. $527 billion was the number last year. Now, this also, by the way, reduces the amount of shares outstanding that the public can own. So it's taking more and more stock off the stock markets, by the way, where also your pension funds have to invest. So there's less and less available for anybody to participate in the public stock of this country.
Yes, the stock market's being taken private with the help of artificially cheap interest rates. And after this capitalist failure comes neo-feudalism.
And on top of that, by the way, they're not just buying their shares back with cash, they're buying it back with debt. And part of that is tax shenanigans, like Apple has hundreds of billions of dollars overseas, but the only way to get it back without being taxed on it is to issue debt here and buy share backs.
And where does that debt ultimately go? It goes from Bank A to Bank B to Bank C to Bank D to foreign bank to Bank Z to Bank Q, all the way to the Federal Reserve Bank. How did they get multi-trillion dollars worth of debt? Oh, is it financial engineering and financial apartheid? Who will bail out the Federal Reserve Bank? Oh, it'll be a bail-in. That's right. All of your savings will be given to the new Federal Reserve Chairman, because otherwise there would be a humanitarian crisis. We need to avoid any humanitarian crisis.
So another story to put into this context of workers' hourly wages not increasing and them not seeing any benefit to the tax cuts, but the tax cuts will add to the deficit and the national debt in a big way. But here's another story out from Truth in Accounting, and they're looking at the U.S. if they had to provide accounting like all other humans and corporations and entities do. And that is U.S. government spending may exceed 60% of GDP. U.S. federal government spending is expected to bloat to over $4.7 trillion during fiscal 2020, according to Congressional Budget Office data released this week. However, aggressive accounting may be hiding a far worse situation. Total spending by the Trump administration this fiscal year may be more than double what the nonpartisan CBO admits. Worse, overall U.S. federal, state, and local government spending may exceed 60% of GDP. And we'll go into how this is calculated, but basically all those Social Security and Medicare payments actually are not counted now, but the debts, they actually cost now, but the debts are written, they create debt which isn't paid off until like a couple decades from now. So they pretend it didn't happen this year.
Right. They say that the federal debt is $20, $21, $22 trillion. But if you account for the total debt picture, it's $60, $70, $80 trillion. To Donald Trump, I have this message. Mr. President, tear down that wall. That wall being the interest rate apartheid wall.
Oh, I thought you were saying that wall of debt.
That wall of debt. You know, address the internal financial apartheid state first, and then go address these other problems in Mexico and Syria and all the others, foreign adventures that the founders warned us against.
So the warning comes here from Sheila Weinberg, and she's the CEO of Truth in Accounting. Government budgeting works on a cash basis, she says. That enables them to leave many of their expenses and liabilities off the books. So they calculate, her group calculates that the federal government's unrecorded Social Security, Medicare, and other debts have increased by $4.7 trillion a year on average for the past decade. That's on top of the unfunded liabilities. Then there's the national debt, and then there's the national deficit. So right now they're saying the deficit, that our budget shortfall per year is $4.7 trillion, but in fact, they're saying, this Truth in Accounting is saying that actually it's closer to $9 trillion a year that we're spending, which is almost like what our GDP is, $13 trillion.
Okay, so to be clear, this is talking about the deficit, not the debt. The debt, which includes unfunded liabilities that I made reference to, is many more trillions of dollars than we are led to believe. But this is attacking the deficit, which you're saying the deficit is many more trillions of dollars more than we're being told.
The deficit is your annual budget, how much you go over your annual budget. At the end of the year, the year has ended and a new year starts. So you put the 4.7 trillion, or in this case 9 trillion, on top of the debt, the national debt. So that goes back onto that pile that keeps on going higher and higher. In terms of the unfunded liabilities in total, the national debt, what they say is that is 101 trillion at September 2017, less 54.2 trillion when calculated on the same basis at the end of 27. So the deficit is rising, the national debt is rising.
Right, and it can't, and the payment on even at these low rates is hundreds of billions of dollars and escalating incredibly. Anyway, we got to go to a break. Don't go away. Stay right there. Welcome back to the Keiser Report. I'm Max Keiser. Time now to turn to Mitch Firestein. He's the author of the internationally acclaimed Planet Ponzi, now available in various languages. Mitch, welcome back.
Hey, great to be here, Max.
Hey, did you bring your pen around this time?
This one, the one that breaks?
Yeah, that's a very expensive pen. And how many of these have I broken so far, Mitch? 5, 6? It's tough to come on this show.
But they fixed them. It's great.
Incredible.
Mont Blanc is fantastic.
Show the people your shoelaces.
No,
come on, show the shoe. Take your. Come on.
No,
we'll do that before the end of the show. We'll show them. Now let's get into some interesting topics here. Mitch Firestein, the Federal Reserve balance sheet. Because this explains everything. You are the man of the charts. You brought some charts. What's happening?
We've got some charts today. Yes, the first one we're going to look at is the Federal Reserve's nearly $5 trillion balance sheet. This explains how we've got the most grotesque asset bubbles in history. So the Fed just keeps printing money, and that's why markets keep levitating, and we've seen the most grotesque bubbles in bonds, stocks, property, and credit markets that in history around the world. And the other central banks, like the Bank of Japan, European Central Bank, and the Bank of England, have jumped on the money printing bandwagon.
Let me jump in for a second, because you talk about asset bubbles, but it also leads to malinvestment, because there's no accountability if some industries know that every mistake is met with more free money. And I'm thinking about the military and the defense contractors, who do very well by just bombing people with no accountability. They don't go to Congress, they don't go to Parliament, they don't ask to bomb people, they just bomb people, because they know that there's no end to the money. There's no accountability, and they're in cahoots with these central banks in a large way. Is that a fair statement?
Yeah, well, I mean, look at some of the military-industrial complex characters like Boeing and Lockheed Martin. There are a couple of them that are up almost 2,000% since the war on terror. But the war on, what is the war on terror really? It seems more like it's a war on democracy. And look, I mentioned this on a show a long time ago. First, what you have is a currency war, which we had 8 or 9 years ago. We're still seeing currency wars. Currency wars lead to trade wars, and trade wars lead ultimately to hot wars. Now, the war on democracy, I mean, this is propaganda squared. I mean, you can't believe anything that's in the traditional media anymore. CNN, for example, owns CNN Turkey, which is a propaganda network. CNN America is not much better in terms of propaganda. But whenever, say, the UK, think about the propaganda on BBC and think about what Theresa May and Boris the Liar Johnson have done to bring a war into Syria and the events in Salisbury where they said, oh, the Russians did it after 5 hours. And then, of course, Assad bombed people. You don't need evidence anymore to start a war. They don't go to parliament. They don't need the people to say it's okay. If they want war, war it is, and the military-industrial complex makes money, and we lose, the taxpayers lose.
Okay, and to keep this, in the frame of kind of my perspective that I'm trying to put across here, is that a lot of it can be accounted for by having an economy that has no accountability, and that non-accountability and malinvestment goes back to the central bank, because the central bank is not hewing to any known standards of accounting that would require, for example, tying what they do to gold, for example, as they have done in the past. They simply print with reckless abandon. There's a new guy in charge, Jerome Powell at the Fed. He took over for Janet Yellen. What's the story with him now?
Well, I mean, he is Janet Yellen, except, he's just wearing a different mask. So he's the Bernanke Yellen. They've just shifted the baton.
Let me just, again, jump in. Mitch, we're talking about central banks. Okay. Now, Russia, you mentioned Russia. Right. They have a central bank. It's from a woman named Elvira. Mm-hmm. Is her first name.
Exactly.
I can't remember her last name, but I love the first name. How would you contrast these two central bankers? Because a lot of people, like James Rickards, for example, says that the central bank woman who leads the Russian central bank is the best in the world. Why does he say that?
Well, I think, if you look at the economies, you can't compare the United States economy to Russia's economy. And, you have to analyze and identify what are, the global threats and what are not global threats. And if you look at what's the economy in Russia, it's under $2 trillion in real terms. The United States economy is around 17 trillion to 19 trillion, depending upon what numbers you look at. It's minuscule. But the United States has debt to the magnitude of around $250 trillion when you include all the social welfare entitlement programs like Social Security, Medicare.
What's the book
Medicaid.
value of America?
It's negative.
What's the book value of Russia?
Bankrupt.
What's the book value of Russia?
There's no real debt in Russia.
It has a positive book value. Russia has a positive book value. America has a negative book value.
It's what I'm getting at. There's not really a lot of debt, which is really significant in the global scheme of things. So if you disrupt the global narrative, which is what we have going on right now, globalism is a big narrative. If you look at what happened, going back, digressing a bit to the central banks and the central banks supporting zombie institutions with low interest rates. So you've got a bunch of companies that should have gone bankrupt. Tesla is a perfect example that lives off of government subsidies and the fat of the land. If you didn't have 0% interest rates in the European Central Bank meddling in the corporate bond markets and the Swiss National Bank buying equities, you wouldn't have support like this. But then you've got other narratives in the background that are running to try to run globalism and have the military-industrial complex and the characters of the deep state pushing propaganda out to everybody who will believe it.
All right, let's talk about the dams in the system. You put up a dam across a river, and the water goes over that dam, and it produces hydroelectric power. The reason I mention that is by way of an analogy to get to my next point and chart, which is money velocity. Here's a dam in the works of global finance that's not producing any energy. It's producing kind of like constipation in many ways.
Yeah.
Money velocity, we've talked about it before. It's still trending lower despite all of this money printing. Walk us through it.
Right. Well, this illustrates that we're in an environment where eventually we'll have hyperinflation and it will not be controllable by the central banks who think they know everything. And this is going to catch a lot of people off foot. Look, you can never pick, as I've said before, the top of a bubble, but I can tell you we're definitely in a bubble right now in every market. If you look at the chart on the velocity of money, you'll see that it's crashed to low levels not even seen in 1959, yet the governments keep telling us that we're in an economic recovery. So it's a fake economic recovery. The narrative is a total lie, and most of the people watching this show will realize that things haven't gotten better economically, and there is lots of asset inflation. So if you take, for example, the prices of tuition up 2,000% from the 1980s, but your real wages, when you inflation adjust, are stagnant. So how do you explain that or square the circle?
Okay, let's say the small to medium enterprises that are the lifeblood of any economy. They can't get loans from banks, but if I walk into a big money center bank that's getting huge money from the central bank and I need $1 billion or $2 billion to buy a multi-billion-dollar property on Central Park South, they'll say, sure. They'll give it to me.
Well,
because, in other words, it's crony capitalism writ large. And what we have here is a situation where the money is not flowing to the economy to support small to medium enterprises because the banks simply don't want to take any risk whatsoever. They hoard the money. They participate themselves in these loans as merchant banks. You know, they've all become merchant banks. They're all becoming equity holders in the money that they're lending, out. To capitalize on the inflation of the assets that they hold on their own balance sheets, which then pump the stock prices higher, which pumps the option prices higher, which pumps the compensation for guys like Jamie Dimon and Lloyd Blankfein higher. So they, by putting a tourniquet on the economy, by stopping the economic flow, by dropping money velocity to zero, they have inflated their net worths in an historic way.
Right, they have. But I mean, what's worse with that problem and what the government should be doing is they shouldn't be paying banks interest. The Federal Reserve shouldn't be paying excessive reserve interest, and they should retool that entire corrupt system where the banks make money by holding excess reserves that are from money printing. So, and
to be clear, that not only is the bank's cost of borrowing zero,
yeah, exactly.
It's
you get
accretive.
Paid to do it. Right,
you
exactly.
get paid to borrow money.
Right.
The banks borrow money from the central bank, and then they put it on deposit at the central bank.
Right.
So the more they borrow, the more they make. So the risk reward and the whole idea of capitalism of taking a risk for a reward is inverted. Here you're saying that the more risk we take, the more reward we make without any penalty whatsoever.
Well, if you look, we did a program with Brexit, for example, when they had Brexit, and you remember what the fearmongers were saying. Theresa May was one of them, saying it would be the end of the world, markets would crash, sterling would go to zero. Look, sterling is right back at 144, where we were when Brexit began, yet the stock market's 20% higher. And today, it was announced in the UK that they had record low unemployment, not seen since 1971. So can you believe that? Is that credible? Is any of it credible? Absolutely not. So you know that the production situation hasn't improved. That house prices have skyrocketed there into bubble territory everywhere, and real wages haven't gone up. So what's happened? The banks lend money, as you said, to real estate property developers at ridiculously low rates, but they take a piece of the action, and as these apartments get built 3 years later down the road, they're not going to be able to sell any of them, and these special purpose vehicles that they developed are all going to go bust. But this time, there's going to be no will to bail them out, and that's going to happen in the United States as well as in the United Kingdom.
Right, the real wages, as you say, have not moved whatsoever. So if you get a gig economy job and you're delivering a bicycle full of food at minimum wage, and you're out there and dodging traffic before you get hit and end up in the NHS, I mean, they count that as job growth. However, when you add back all the variables into this equation, you end up with the average wages stagnating or depreciating, but the numbers on the top line are being showcased as being proof of recovery, and yet there is no proof of recovery. Okay, so let's talk about the Schiller National Home Price Index. Tell us about that. What's going on? You got a chart?
Right, we've got a chart here that explains house prices from 1987 to 2018. And basically, if you look at the increase in prices, you know, Ben Bernanke said that subprime was not a problem. Don't worry, it's all under control. And then you saw prices at, I guess, 2006 start to peak out and then drop down quite a bit.
All right, I want to jump in because I want to cover two things. Rental prices in New York City are tumbling. What's your quick hot take on that?
Well, I mean, there's too much supply, not enough demand, not enough high-paying jobs. Of course, they're going to keep collapsing. As I've said,
did you see that trend continuing? They're down 13% already.
Yeah, I think real estate prices, property values can drop up to 80% or even more.
What? 80%? We're like Tokyo in 1989?
That's exactly right. That's
oh my
right.
God, Mitch.
The prices in Tokyo.
All right, let's move on. 30 seconds. Gold.
Gold is the only chart that we have that is not an asset bubble, and prices are realistic on gold and will keep going higher. So physical gold is really a place that everybody should look to hide out.
Okay, well, you heard it here first. 80% drop in property prices. A Tokyo-esque collapse in Manhattan is coming. Mitch Firestein, author of Planet Ponzi, the internationally acclaimed tome that is translated into over 2 languages. And that's going to do it for this edition. Well, show them your shoes. Come on.
The shoes?
Show the shoe. Look at this. Give me this shoe. Give me this shoe. Come on. Look at this. Look at this. This is, when you're a money manager famous in New York, this is the kind of shoe you wear, okay? Keep that in mind. You can find us on Twitter at Keiser Report. Until next time, bye, y'all.